Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to introduce your next keynote speaker. Chris Inglis currently serves as the first Senate-confirmed National Cyber Director and advisor to the President of the United States on cybersecurity. He previously worked as a U.S. Naval Academy Looker Distinguished Visiting Professor for Cyber Studies, as a Managing Director of Paladin Capital, a member of the boards of several public and private corporations, and as a Commissioner on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He retired from the Department of Defense in January 2014 after 41 years of federal service, including 28 years at the National Security Agency and 7.5 years as its Deputy Director. He served as a member of the Department of Defense Science Board, as a National Intelligence University trustee until early 2021. A 1976 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, go Navy, Chris holds advanced degrees in engineering and computer science from Columbia University, Johns Hopkins University, and the George Washington University. Chris's military career includes 30 years of service in the U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard, from which he retired as a Brigadier General. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Chris Inglis.
Thank you, George. When you're old enough, your resume goes on and on. Thank you for that very warm welcome. That was a great panel. I just may go to questions. No, I suspect I have some things I should say. First, a little bit about context. I am enormously grateful to be here. Like Admiral Harris, I am not a graduate of this institution. I'm actually an Air Force officer. I was grateful that the heathen detector didn't go off when I entered the room. But I did teach at the U.S. Naval Academy for 10 years, 3 years on active duty and 7 years in a civilian capacity. As I like to say in my house, I'm hard pressed to say that here and get away with it, it takes an Air Force officer to raise a naval officer. Because it turns out it's literally true. One of my kids graduated from the Naval Academy. I'm ever so proud of him. Having said all of that, I think what I have an obligation to do today is to provide some remarks about the context of cyberspace, and more particularly what might be an emerging cyber strategy. But I have to note that while the focus is on cyber, I am a cyber hammer in search of a cyber nail, ever true. The context that I think Admiral Harris talked about, that Senator Reid talked about, is the more important context. I will say later in my remarks that cyber does not exist for its own sake. Cyber only exists so that we can use it to do the things that we do care about. And so I'll start by giving that acknowledgement right up front, which is meant to be a statement of humility, but at the same time, accountability. Paradox at the end of the day is that cyber is sufficiently unique that its characteristics require us to deem it a fifth domain, as if it's a separate domain. Because unless you understand cyber's characteristics, as well as you understand sea, air, land, and space, you're condemned to be befuddled by it. You'll never quite understand what's happening. You'll be continued to kind of push or kind of hit the wrong button, not knowing what's going on. But the paradox is that it's by no means independent of the other domains. And it's a great risk to sometimes, as we often do, think that if something cyber happens to me, or if something cyber has afflicted me, that the only response, the right response, is a cyber response. It's a worse instinct to think that I have to wait until something happens to me, that we can't control this domain. We can't bring this domain, if not to heal, at least to achieve conditions within it that are eminently predictable and within which we can focus not on the threats to this space, not obsess about the threats to this space, but obsess about our positive aspirations in, through, and by this space. So what I'll spend some time on today is I'm going to start with some characteristics of cyberspace. Now, having just heard that panel, I'm hard-pressed to kind of sing too much of that song to this choir. I think much of that is known in this audience, but it's so important. We have to actually understand how cyber actually is composed, how it works, and why we care, if we're to defend, or if we're to define, implement, and defend a strategy to then make sure that it does what we want it to do. If we think it is something that it's not, we'll be working on the wrong end of this elephant, and we need to make sure that we're addressing all the parts. I will then talk a little bit about the context of cyberspace, why we care about cyberspace. Not for bragging rights, not so we have some swell conversation at the water cooler that we have the coolest insight about something cyber, but what do we do with it? What do we want it to do for us? What is it we want to actually have as our positive aspirations about it? And then form following function, I'll last, but speak briefly about what we're doing to organize for that, specifically within the US government. But as I think you heard on that panel, and it's quite correct, This is a moment in time where the US government and other like-minded governments need to understand that 85, 90% of this work is ideated, innovated, generated, capacity is developed, it's delivered, sustained, and defended by the private sector. Governments need to increasingly see themselves as the supporting organization for a private sector, which increasingly on the skirmish or the front lines of this must be the supported organization. But I'll talk a little bit about what we're actually doing to try to bring that about. So let's start with thing one. What is cyberspace? The noun of cyberspace sometimes is so obvious that we're kind of lost in kind of the admiration of it. It, of course, is paced by technology. We all have iPhones or Galaxy equivalents or some such thing. We all know what the generation of technology that we're holding on to is. Probably know something about the apps we're running on that. We generally know that there is a cloud, but we focus on the hardware, the software, the firmware, and all that stuff that is the tangible asset known as the internet or the internet plus or cyberspace. We too seldom, though, imagine that there's something more to cyberspace that is implicated in the futures of cyberspace, and I would mention two specifically. First of those is people. People are not merely served by cyberspace. They're not beside cyberspace, on top of cyberspace, afflicted by cyberspace. They're in cyberspace. Why do I say that? Because the choices that people make about the technology they use and what they do with it implicate cyber futures, good and bad, all day, every day. And I'll give a very specific example in a moment. And the other piece, the third piece that is part of the noun of cyberspace, is the fancy word which I'm sure is used often enough here that you'll immediately recognize it for what it is, but doctrine, which in a less formal way is just roles and responsibilities. Do we know who's accountable for what in and through or about cyberspace? I mention those three because if an adversary was in this room, I know there are none here except on Air Force Navy Day. If an adversary was in this room, they would be thinking about those three characteristics of the noun in the reverse order. They would first say, if I want to hold this thing and the functions dependent upon it at risk, I'm going to first think about the roles and responsibilities. Is nobody defending this supply chain? Is no one accountable for defense in this thing? If the answer to that question is yes, I don't have to worry about anything else. I'm just going to walk through that open front door. We've seen examples of that. It was remarkable to me that at some point, it's a fairly significant supply chain incident known as SolarWinds. And when you walked up that chain of custody and asked, who was it that invested security in this piece of software and then sustained that over time, turns out at the end of the day, no one. Right? And so the expectations of customers that this thing would inherently be resilient and robust and security was not simply going to be supported by this, was inherited in this or inherent in this. It just wasn't there because the roles and responsibilities had not been defined. And broadly, generically, strategically, we've not defined those roles in the macro sense either. What does government do in this space? What does the private sector do in this space? And to Chris Demchek's point, a very, very important point, what do we do together as much or more as we might do apart? If we haven't defined those things, then we're wide open for doctrinal failures, which our adversaries are quite good at taking advantage of. People, if you find that the doctrine's squared away, they've actually made a proper assignment of who's accountable for what, you then think about, can I find someone who's complacent, perhaps not up to speed that day, doesn't know what happens when they click on the link? It's the adversary's code, the kind of user's kind of authorities and permission. That's the most unhappiest of combinations. If I can get that person to make that mistake, and about 80% of the time, that's actually the mistake that's made that has these front page of the newspaper events behind it, then I don't have to worry about whether there's a flaw in the technology, the hardware, the software. I just take advantage of the person. We have to get all three of those pieces right. We have to get the doctrine right. We have to get the people piece right. And we have to get the technology right. But I would suggest in that order. And we need to bend technology to the first two purposes as opposed to being in this admiration that essentially causes us to miss the point. The technology might not have been designed with security in mind. It might not therefore be up to the task of serving our doctrinal needs and serving perhaps our people needs. Too many times, for example, we expect a person to do something that's easily routinized, easily automated. We don't need to rely on people to do some of the things that we cause them to do, but we do because the technology hasn't been built to support their needs. Why do we care about cyberspace? If that's what the noun of cyberspace is, this might not be something we care about, except for the fact that we should. Jeff Moss, he's the fellow who essentially is of DEF CON and Black Hat fame. He kind of essentially was the co-originator of those two great events. He asked this wonderful question at the beginning of his talks. Generally starts his talk with, does anyone here know why race cars have bigger brakes? At which point I break eye contact thinking it's a cyber talk. I'm totally unprepared to answer that question. He immediately answers the question to say race cars have bigger brakes so that they can go faster. Oh, why is that important? He then says, why do we have cyber? Not for its own sake. We have cyber because I want to do things with the internet. I have personal aspirations. I might manage my bank account. I might manage my social calendar. I have business aspirations. I might want to kind of penetrate markets that I can't physically get to, but I'm going to offer my services across the internet. Or I might want to coordinate my logistics. I might want to reach out and get some economical aspects of a supply chain working for me. Or I might have societal aspirations that I'm going to manage my critical functions, possibly even an election, using digital infrastructure or the generation and flow of electricity. Those are all the reasons why we care about digital infrastructure. Those are all the reasons why we care about cyber. Those are all the reasons we care about cybersecurity. So we should put cyber in its proper place, not by elevating it, because it's not important for its own sake, but by subordinating it to those interests. If we do that, we then can mobilize a degree of interest on the part of everyone who would say, well, if that's why we care about cyberspace, so that I can do what I want to do, you just might get people to participate in their own defense. Instead, today you have what I would describe as willful ambivalence. There are a whole lot of folks who look at this space, they see smoke issuing forth from some particular closet, and they say to themselves, somebody's going to get a beating because somebody should be handling this problem. Somebody should be doing something about this problem. When in fact, every one of us needs to participate in the defense of this space, just like we do in the physical space. I left the airport at Reagan National Airport this morning, left my car under a camera that's in that parking lot for a good reason. I did not leave my iPad on the dash of that car. I made sure that the camera that's mounted on the post, kind of the rearview mirror post, was pointed outward and had the blinking red light on it. Whether or not it has any viable function is beyond the point. And there are probably any number of people who kind of walking by that car today that might, maybe 1 in 1,000, might have said, I think I'll take advantage of that car because that person's probably away for the day. They didn't. 2 points to that. One, I participated in my own defense. I knew that all of the systems set up to make it such that I can have confidence, I can go about my business in the physical world. I had to participate in that defense. And two, I'm going to bring this point back later when I talk about deterrence. I really don't care who decided not to break into my car. Attribution isn't what it's cut out to be. If you decide not to attack me, I don't care who you are. Deterrence can work if you focus it on the decision calculus of those who would otherwise hold you at risk. We need to think about it in those foundational terms. So, if that's true, what I said about the noun and what I said about why we care about cyberspace, then I think we need to collectively understand that if we're to put a strategy on the street, that we need to think about it in economic and national security terms and individual and private sector terms in between. And yet, we have experienced wave after attacks over the last 40, 50 years. I think I agree with Chris Demchek again that there's a lot of deficit here. Now, it might be described as technology deficit or the failure to define roles and responsibilities, or maybe it's even the people skills deficit. The good news is we continue to fill cyber and IT jobs at about the 2/3 rate. The bad news is the denominator is racing away from us. There are only 711,000 jobs at the moment that require cyber or IT skills in the United States that are empty. Last year, the figure was 550,000. So we've got a lot of deficit. And the attacks that we've then seen adversaries undertake said that it might not be that there's a deficit on the attack side or the kind of the adversary side, but there is a stunning deficit on the defense side. That's a failure to reconcile, right, those two kind of inputs in a way that I think that we're finding unacceptable. 40 years ago, when I got started in this business, I was a computer scientist. I was happy once. Was trying to defend what we called information security systems in the day that we thought would be perfect, impervious to any manner of assault. Turns out we had neglected at that time what the role of the person would be and the roles of various parties, the doctrinal aspects of it. But what we were trying to defend against was adversaries who would hold data and systems at risk. And that's when we came up with the kind of the revered triad, the CIA triad, doesn't stand for that other agency, confidentiality, integrity, availability. If we can defend the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and there are actually quite tried and true ways to do that, we could defend the hazard that's occasioned against data and systems. But maybe 10, 15 years after that, we began to use that data and systems not just for individual and bespoke purposes, but we began to combine that into systems of systems. We began to generate, right, systems of interest that delivered functions, some critical, some not to us. And if you want to defend that, because that's also held at risk, the abstraction of data and systems is abstracted into the generation and delivery of critical functions. If you want to defend that, you have to step back and realize that the generation of that critical function is delivered through a collaboration, typically across the government and the private sector, often richly and diversely within the private sector. And you have to then defend not just data and systems, but you have to defend that collaboration. That takes a collective defense, not a division of effort defense, and I'll come back to that later. And then finally, more recently, in the last 5, 10 years, perhaps richly here in the United States, we've seen a wave of attacks that would hold confidence at risk. And what do I mean by that? When you think about the Colonial Pipeline attack, again, it started as a Russian criminal activity that was trying to find a weakness in that system, found that an individual had not properly configured something called a virtual private network, and having found that single flaw, took advantage of it, got into what was called the administrative side of that system, the IT side of that system, the information technology side of the system. And the administrators, not knowing whether it was richly connected to the pipes, the valves that caused petroleum to flow up and down the pipeline, and perhaps kind of wanting to shut it down before there was damage done to the billing accounts, shut it down. Right? And so having found a flaw in a person kind of had, and having then found a way to hold the system at risk, held the generation of a critical function, the delivery of petroleum stocks up and down the eastern seaboard at risk. But then the most interesting thing happened, which was that people realizing that petroleum gas products were no longer available from that pipeline went to the darkest possible corner, and millions of people up and down the eastern seaboard lost their confidence, flooded the lines. It was as if there was a hurricane coming up the eastern seaboard, and gasoline was suddenly the white bread, right, of the moment, right? And people's confidence went to the darkest possible corner. That can't be lost on our adversaries who think to themselves, if I want to hold the American people at risk, I need to find a not well-defended system, find a single flaw in it, perhaps in the people piece of it, maybe in the doctrinal piece of it, use a mediocre attack to hold that at risk, allow that then to populate its way into holding the critical function that that system's responsible for at risk, and then ultimately hold the confidence at risk. And oh, by the way, follow that with an information attack to say, this is just a down payment. That is perhaps the most pernicious of all of that. And if you want to defend that last level, that confidence level, you need to make sure that you have properly defended the first 2 levels, data and systems, and the collective defense. But you also need to make sure that you're on the front balls of your feet, asserting your defense, make defense your new offense. You actually have to work very hard to beat me. You have to work very hard to defeat my confidence, because I have backup after backup after backup. I can work through this. I can fight hurt. If you don't have the confidence that comes from that degree of understanding and intimacy with your systems, you're not going to shoot your way out of this. So there is a role for offense and defense, but there's a stunning underinvestment in the defense in and of itself. And for those that are waiting for a cyber 9/11 or perhaps a cyber Pearl Harbor to motivate us to do that, I agree with what General Matthews said. It's here. It's just diffused in time and space around us that it hasn't had that single cathartic effect on a group of us that would say, this just happened to us. We see someone well to the left of us, well to the right of us, get picked off, they go down, and we thank our lucky stars that it wasn't us. But it hasn't happened with sufficient intensity in time or place that we realize it for what it is, which is an assault on confidence, an assault on critical functions, and certainly an assault on the data and systems underneath that. And as I'd indicate, others have acted in the space. Malign actors are increasingly bold in that. Competitors shape the technology ecosystem by affecting the standards. They affect the supply chains by getting into those supply chains because the roles and responsibilities haven't been properly defined. And the bias of the rules of the road are in their favor because we've not mobilized a proper defense that focuses on the underpinnings, nor have we mobilized a proper collective defense that makes them beat all of us to beat one of us. That needs to be our new moniker. Now, I often tell a joke at this point because we're in a pretty dark place. But I often tell a joke at this point that this head of an organization wandering around his or her organization runs into this kind of exalted creature known as the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. And having found this person kind of out of the dark room first time ever, and never having had a conversation with this person before, says, I've heard so much about cyber. I haven't got a clue what that is, because it's certainly not something we discuss in the boardroom. Nobody knows what questions to ask about it, but how are we doing in cyber? And the person, kind of being somewhat intimidated, says, in a word, good, right? At which point the CEO, now emboldened, she says, well, in 2 words, how are we doing? In 2 words, not good, right? Now, turns out that both both of those things are true at the same time. We have done stunning things with this digital infrastructure. It was earlier mentioned that we developed and delivered a vaccine within, 12 to 15 months? That heretofore would have been impossible, right? We do things to analyze the climate in ways that allow us to predict it, at least these massive incursions of weather into our personal lives in ways that would have simply been mysterious and impossible. We can, in fact, kind of advance, right, all of our positive aspirations using digital infrastructure and analytics that run across the top of that because we have made that technology available. And we still are the innovation engine of the world. But I agree, that is not something that we have cornered the market on. That's the good part. But the bad part is we've not invested accordingly in the things that deliver those great goods. We have a tech deficit, we have a people deficit, we have a doctrinal deficit in terms of roles and responsibilities. But I think that those are relatively straightforward propositions about what we would do. Like climate change, we can't turn this around in 2 weeks. This is something that's long in the making, and it will be perhaps medium long in the fixing, but we need to start by saying that we intend to fix that. So what should we do? First, I would say we need to seize the initiative, see defense as the new offense. Invest in this the way we invested in other systems of interest. Back to that car that I left at that airport that I'm sure is safe. That car has an air safety bag in it, that car has a seatbelt in it, that car has anti-lock brakes on it, and I didn't have to ask for any of those. That car I drive on road systems that don't have jagged edges kind of hurling in from all corners, and has a reasonably kind of well-behaved set of people alongside of me driving their cars, because there's a system that educates them and they understand what the risks are, and even the occasional transgressor is kind of stopped along the side of the road, pays a $100 fine, and we kind of suppress that bad activity. There's a system of systems. It's not just the technology, a system of systems that's invested in the resilience and robustness of that, and then expects me to participate in my own defense. We need to make that sort of investment in the digital infrastructure that delivers all of these great goods. And I mentioned the three nouns. We need to invest across all three of those. On doctrine, we need to get the roles and responsibilities right across the private and the public sector. On people, we need to solve not just the challenge of filling the jobs that have cyber or IT in them, but we need to make sure that every person knows as much about cyberspace as they know about managing a hot stove. They often do not. Ask a student kind of where the cloud is, and they will kind of look ethereally into the distance and say, it's out there somewhere. But they have no idea where their data is, who's defending the data in that cloud, and what's going to happen when that data that they don't want to be seen by somebody else is. I don't want them to be Python programmers, each and every one, but I want them to know enough about what the complications or implications are of their reliance on digital infrastructure. Teach them as much about cyberspace as we teach them about crossing the street or a hot stove. And in the middle, there's a group that the Naval Academy, I think, thoughtfully calls the many crowd, whether they're CEOs or lawyers or logisticians or even computer scientists, who do not, in the United States, have to take a hands-on course in cybersecurity. They need to know more about cybersecurity or the inherent resilience and robustness of these systems than they do based upon the curriculum that was developed over millennia. I was trained as a mechanical engineer many years ago using a slide rule. That was a day. But in that curriculum, I could have gone out and built systems that spewed toxins into the nearby river. I did not. But I could have done that, and I would not have been held accountable because that was somebody else's problem. That's no longer the case. If you become a certified mechanical engineer or engineer of any regard, right, you have a strong component of ethics and environmental responsibility built into those courses. We need to, for that group in the middle, the many group, in law schools and perhaps business schools and coding schools, we need to invest enough understanding about what this critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, does for us and what their obligations are to advance it, that they then play their role in it. Not because cyber is the most important thing in the world, but because it supports the most important activities in the world, the things we care about as individuals, businesses, and societies. Second, we need to empower the private sector where most of cyber's value is created, sustained, and defended. Cyberspace is largely borderless. There is no boundary per se between nation states, and so we need to do this in the largest possible venue. Government has unique authorities and unique capabilities, and it needs to put those on the table. And in a collaboration, it needs to be able to go first when that's required. It shouldn't play go fish. It shouldn't ask. It shouldn't wait to be asked. Government often has the ability to provide intelligence support, prioritized assistance, liability relief, and on occasion, the ability to specify that certain features are not discretionary in a given architecture, the way we have for cars and airplanes and therapeutics. The government has the responsibility to step in and say, for this critical function, these are the mandatory elements. no less, no more. These are the mandatory elements. The private sector is where the scope and scale comes from. And the private sector can, and only can, generate the capacity for resilience and robustness at scale. Think of what's now happening in the Ukraine, right? What you see is Russia attempting to effect attack after attack after attack, egregious attacks against the Ukrainian people. Some of those are cyber attacks. Microsoft report written about a month and a half, 2 months ago described some of those in great detail, 27 attacks in all at the time of that writing. And what's happening is that under the terms of service, companies like Cisco, like Microsoft, like ESET, are actually delivering resilience and robustness as an inherent attribute of those systems. So the Russians now find themselves having to beat not just the Ukrainians, but the private sector that essentially is providing robust and resilient products. That is not an aggressive activity on the part of those companies. It is not a provocative activity on the part of those companies. In the same way that my automobile company will call me when they find that the airbag in my car is from a deficient lot and they'll replace it, those companies are simply operating under their terms of service at a scope and scale that no one else can. We've created a collective defense, or the Ukrainians have created a collective defense that the Russians didn't expect, and that the Russians are hard-pressed to beat, because now they have to beat many of us to beat one of us. That's new, that's different. That is profoundly different than a division of effort that says, good luck to you defending your side, I'll be over here defending my side, and there the twain shall meet. Divisions of effort are often an agreement to not collaborate. The third is, we need to do what I just said, which is to flip the script. When I describe the Colonial Pipeline event, that's a transgressor essentially beating one person to hold at risk millions of people. We need to flip that. You need to beat the millions to beat the one, right? We need to actually have it such that all of us participate in the defense of this realm in a way that's collectively adding up to something greater than the arithmetic sum of the parts. That is not as hard to do as it sounds if we simply understand who is accountable for what, and that each of us then plays the appropriate role in that defense. And government to government, the national or the international domain, that is absolutely on the table. 60 nations about 2 months ago showed up at the White House and signed something called a Declaration for the Internet. Interesting terminology, a declaration for the Internet. What do those 60 nations want the Internet to be for? What do those 60 nations want the Internet's properties to be? A free and open and interoperable Internet that serves the needs of their respective societies. Now there can be an extension, or extensions plural off of that, that serve the unique national needs. But first and foremost, there was a rallying cry that says this is a shared resource and we should understand what we do together to make sure it has the right properties, and then participate in a collective defense of all the elements that I described. And back to what's then happening in the Ukraine, what you now see is Vladimir Putin stuck in the 20th century, fighting a 20th century war. Zelensky has moved forward to the 21st century, waging a 21st century information campaign. I would tell you that on the eve of that crisis, I would have underestimated the strength of a stout defense against a numerically superior offense. But I think what the Ukrainians have showed us is that preparation and a collective defense and an ability to then project ideas, to shape kind of opinions on top of that robustly defended infrastructure can in fact at least hold its own, if not win the day. And I therefore think that we need to give new credence and new thought, new consideration to the defense. As the Biden-Harris administration has said many times, competition in the 21st century necessarily involves China. China, as you've heard earlier, seeks to use all instruments of national power to mount a sustained challenge to the national order and to the United States and like-minded nations' view of the system of systems. They're not arguing as much for the wresting of control of the system we built and operate, but rather a new system of systems. That's a competition, and we need to win that competition, and we need to win it on merit the old-fashioned way. We therefore are strengthening our ability to defend vital interest, but we also need to compete. Just saying no is not the answer to this challenge. We have to actually have ideas, we have to have solutions, we have to have alternatives. When we would say that the alternative provided by a competitor is not the right one, we have to actually fill the vacuum that then results. Let me say a word or two about deterrence, which I've already mentioned briefly, but leaving aside the still unsettled aspects of formal policy, which you could see is not quite settled amongst nations or within a given nation, I think it's nonetheless practical to think about what deterrence means. Not in the nuclear age or the cyber age, but what does deterrence mean? If you look it up in the Webster Dictionary. And in general, what deterrence is kind of an artifact that actually equates to an effect in the realm of the mind, not the realm of a particular domain of interest. At the end of the day, deterrence is trying to change the decision calculus of somebody who might otherwise hold you at risk. Get them to decide to not do something they might otherwise be tempted or otherwise have already decided to do because of something you did, some attribute, some artifact, some action you take or propose to take. That's deterrence. And if deterrence then is about the human being and changing the decision calculus of that human being, while it might not work the same way in the mechanism that it worked in the nuclear age, it won't. It can still work in the cyber age. We can still change the decision calculus of those who would hold us at risk. Now, Richard Harknett thoughtfully said years ago that the real difference between the nuclear age of deterrence and the cyber age of deterrence is to be found in the idea that in the nuclear age, the whole game was to keep the weapon off the field. It was offense dominant. If the weapon showed up, it was a binary, right? You lost, right? That was a great failure. All of the second strike ability in the world wasn't going to serve you well because what you found is your society had just been destroyed. In the cyber age, however, it's offense persistent. The cost of entry is so low and the range of effects, is so much a continuum, it's really almost impossible to keep it off the field. So in a cyber age, the decision calculus you're trying to affect is across a much broader range and to a much broader population. But there still is an ability to affect the decisions of human beings who choose to enter into that space or do not. The first thing you want to do is to make yourself a harder target. Change the decision calculus of saying, are you an easy target, or maybe I just move on to the next one? You need to make sure that having made yourself a harder target, you think about all three dimensions of that problem: doctrine, people, and technology. Having made yourself a harder target, you need to realize that it's an offense persistent world. The best you're going to do is to make yourself defensible. You must actually defend yourself, which means you must then understand how your systems are being employed. Technologists would say, great, we're going to run analytics across that architecture to understand what life forces are coursing through it. I would advise human beings to simply be kind of critical in their thinking about what's happening with my system. If it doesn't look right, feel right, seem right, it might just be that it's not right, step in. But be cognizant of the fact that the best you have is a defensible system. You must actually participate in its defense. And having participated in the stout defense to find, box, interdict, evict something in short order, again, you probably don't yet have an attribution problem because you don't really care who it is you just evicted from your system unless it's a long-term trend, in which case you want to then take care of that by saying, I'm going to build up my kind of statistics on this, instrument this problem. If I find that this problem is always coming from place X, APT1, then I will then deal with that in the third phase of my deterrence strategy, which is if you keep kind of transgressing, if you keep crossing that threshold, and if you have the capability to hold me at risk in ways I find acceptable, then I will impose costs on you of another kind using all instruments of power. That, while not formal policy, essentially comes from Webster's dictionary as straightforward ways to change the decision calculus of a human being. I've described it in a cyber context, but you could describe it in virtually any other context. The ease, the agility, the certainty of that in cyberspace might be kind of less kind of comfortable to us than it was perhaps in the nuclear age, but deterrence is what it's always been. It's about the person. So we begin by protecting ourselves so malicious actors can't hold us at risk. And then we shape that ecosystem so that we participate in a collective defense and we get the roles and responsibilities right. I've said a little, I want to say a lot about international collaboration, but maybe I just emphasize the point, which is the collective defense that we're speaking of must be done in the international domain using all instruments of power. There are some times when the numerical superiority that comes from that is our advantage, but oftentimes, right, it's the perspective or the influence that another nation has allied with our like-minded interests that can carry the day in ways that we never could. So some of our relationships aren't simply about building capacity, they're about building a moral cause that has a greater and wider effect. They're about extending kind of the sorts of influence we might have to other like-minded nations using the relationships and the instruments that they have. Again, to defeat all of us, we propose that you have to defeat all of us because every one of us depends on that. Let me just say a little bit about organizing for success and some of the tactical activities that are underway with strategic import so that I can tell you something about the down payment. Then I'd like to go to your questions so that we can cover those in some detail. The very existence of the job that I'm in, which was created by law just about 1 year and 3/4 ago, reflects the idea that the Congress, and then backstopped by the executive branch, believes that coherence in and amongst the various piece parts that constitute this system is important, right? That we have to get the various roles and responsibilities properly laid out so that we can actually have an optimum application of these diverse, deep and sharp talents in ways before that were only applied using division of effort. So my job, first and foremost, is to not so much be the operator. I'm not a czar. I don't have a megaphone that essentially yells across Washington on a daily basis. My job is to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are properly defined, that we're driving public-private collaboration, not division of effort, that we're focused on future resilience, because present resilience is too often focused on response. 3-alarm fire brigades that essentially launch to try to take care of the problem of the moment are generally successful putting out the fire before it burns down the whole house. But if we did that perfectly, we just lose more slowly. We need to get ahead of these problems. As I was trained as an Air Force pilot, good professionals can get out of any scrape. Great ones don't get into them, right? So let's get great about this. Let's avoid these things by focusing on future resilience. And then finally, there needs to be a performance assessment component. That too is my responsibility of how do we actually have some performance assessment that understands whether the dollars, the roles, responsibilities, and the people skills have been applied to achieve a good and great effect. I don't operate alone in this space. The Office of the National Cyber Director is but one of the players in this space. That's a feature, not a problem, right? So you have various other representatives in this audience who represent deep and sharp capabilities in terms of understanding vulnerabilities in this space, and either then causing to defend those or to put us in a place where if they're unique to a particular adversary, we can perhaps hold them at risk. There are others in this room who deal with sectors, specific sectors. Perhaps it might be the finance sector, the energy sector, the telecommunications sector, who try to understand what the government assistance to that sector might be, understand what the government resources might be. Sometimes it's intelligence, sometimes it's best practices, sometimes it's a specification of what the standard should be. Oftentimes it's a relief of liability, but how do we actually, in a proactive manner, deliver the resources of the US government to the supported sector, the private sector, putting the government in the supporting sector. All of those living side by side by side. If we get it right, they'll be coherent and complementary. They'll be proactive in pushing for a private-public collaboration. They will be focused on future resilience as much as current, present response. And ultimately, we'll get to the place where we can measure what our success is. Now, there are any number of activities underway, whether it's a specific investment in the underlying infrastructure, Executive Order 14028. Forget the term, just know that the government has actually kind of specified for itself that all of these things it's been saying for years should be doing digital infrastructure. We're going to compel that to be done in the government itself, so that we have two-factor authentication, we have encryption for the data at rest, we have segmentation built in, all those things that technologists would say you should do. We actually are having a quite strong push in terms of how do we provide information to the private sector in time for them to do something about it. The Ukrainian crisis was a case in point, where you would have seen in the press time after time, members of the kind of private sector said, I was approached by the government, they gave me some information that was useful to my knowledge of what threats might exist in my domain. I was able then to do something about that. And the further collaboration that takes place at places like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which actually has private and public sector members on the floor collaborating, not sharing information, not playing go fish, but collaborating to find and mitigate issues that can't be found by one party alone. All of that is the work before us. I'll just close with the following, which is that I've given the broadest possible, fastest possible rush across that thin ice of what that strategy might look like. But I offer again that it has to be based upon a true understanding of how the domain actually works, a succinct understanding of why it matters to us, and therefore participation by all those who have a vested interest in it, not just the cyber people, not just the IT people, not just the commodity in the corner, but every one of us. And an opinion by the federal government and like-minded governments that this is a clarion call for them to be positive and proactive in pushing their support and their collaboration to the private sector, which is where most of this work takes place. I'd be delighted to take a couple of questions, if I might.
What are the largest U.S. private sector companies in cyber?
I'm sorry, what is the
largest U.S. private sector companies in cyber?
That would be dangerous for me to say. I'm not supposed to favor one over the other, but there are some companies out there that are well known. I've just mentioned those that are focused specifically on security services like CrowdStrike, Mandiant, FireEye, others. There are a long list of those. That's just an illustrative list. But there are increasingly companies who kind of got into the business because they're providing a commodity of some sort. Maybe it's software, maybe it's hardware. And increasingly, they see themselves in the role of being security providers, not just commodity providers. I'll just call out Microsoft as one of those. When Microsoft says, I will increasingly deliver resilience and robustness, Cisco said the same thing. Other companies have said the same thing. They place themselves in the role of saying, we all have an accountability for cyber. We all have an accountability for security. Not because we love cyber for its own sake, but my earlier point, because of the functions that depend upon that. So I'd be very much at risk if I said anything more, because I'm sure that there's somebody on the stock market right now who's like, do you know what you just did to me? Good or bad, all right? So, other questions?
Hi, thanks. So we've heard today that, earlier today, that there was a large financial institution that's spending over $1 billion on this challenge. You said that we're in the middle of a cyber 9/11. There's a shortage of people. I'd argue the barrier to entry of a private sector company right now is pretty low. And most organizations don't have the financial backing of being a large financial institution or being the government to defend against this problem. You mentioned a lot of really great ideas longer term of how we can all work together and have collective defense. But what does a company do today to survive this and be resilient, especially since a lot of that technology is
that is a great question. So I'm a little bit dated on this, but about a week ago I heard a presentation by a very thoughtful person. I think they got their statistics exactly right. I won't remember all of those, but they said the following. So let me put the strategic context on the table to talk about why that question is so important and what we're doing about that now and later. About 99.9% of the companies in the United States are what would be characterized as small businesses by number, right? Now, it might not be that that's where the dollars are, but by number, 99.9% are small companies. The significant proportion of them, I think it was something on the order of 20, 25%, but don't hold me to that. But a surprisingly significant proportion of those have cyber attacks every year or so when they do the survey. And a significant proportion, greater than 50% of those go out of business, the ones who've had cyber attacks go out of business within the year. Why is that? Because they're not prepared for that, right? They have margins that are sufficiently low that they simply can't withstand that kind of an attack. They have equipment, gear, digital infrastructure that's not fit for purpose, and they don't have the means on top of that to do anything more than run their business. So we can't require them to each spend $1 billion to come up to speed to that large financial concern. We need to make it such that just like when you buy a car, the infrastructure that delivers that also delivers the built-in inherent resilience and robustness. When you buy a pound of the cloud, it should have resilience and robustness built into it. When you buy the next version of a commodity software, resilience and robustness should be built into that. Now that takes time to do, but we're on the road to that. Right? You've seen that play out kind of in the anecdotes that I gave earlier about what Microsoft is saying they're able to do to essentially thwart attacks, not by being provocative or operating outside their terms of service, but by saying inside our terms of service, that's what we'll do. But we need to do that. Two, we need to make sure that those small business concerns understand what risks they're up against to the extent that they can then meaningfully do something about that. I was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas about a week ago. They have this wonderful program there where they take all their IT and their cyber science and computer science majors, and they essentially create what's called a free cyber clinic. And they take them and they say, if you want to get some practical experience, because it turns out you need that to get a job, we'll ally you with a business in the local community who might at the moment think, my whole job is to figure out how do I get enough dough and sauce to kind of like generate tonight's pizzas. But they have a bills receivable, right? An accounts receivable problem. They have an online database problem. They have a credit card problem. And they don't know they have a cyber problem. So they deploy a student alongside, and that student provides some meaningful assistance. Now, that could scale to a much greater degree than I saw in Nevada, Las Vegas, but we need to actually compel that to be the case. And so we're working strategies like that. Finally, we need to make sure that we push to those businesses some sense of what best practices look like. So maybe there's, how we turn the clock once every fall and every spring, and everybody knows you're supposed to change the batteries in your smoke detector at that time, despite the fact that you don't do it. Why don't we have something like that that pushes out with equal facility and ease these best practices of, hey, do you know what your password's good for? Do you know what two-factor authentication is? Take advantage of it. I mean, those can be simple, tried and true, and done at scale if you get the public service announcements to kind of like be in the hands of those that really know how to deliver that message. So there's an awareness issue, there's a training issue, there's an assistance issue, and then there's an infrastructure issue. We have to work all of those. My sense is this is a belts and suspenders and Velcro and zipper and maybe buttons approach. We need to do all of those things to actually have a massive assault on this problem. Maybe one more question? Yes, sir.
My question is about, I understand what you're saying about defense being mainly the responsibility of the private sector, but when the private sector is exposed to a cyber attack, the old saying is the best defense is a great offense. And if a private sector company goes on the offense against the attacker, that company could be construed as like a vigilante or as a deputy. And I wonder how are the offensive attacks in response coordinated, or if at all,
You mean by private companies?
by private companies?
Not, I think. So if a private, to be clear about the law, if a private company were to kind of under assault by something or someone, say, I'm going to hack back, I'm going to operate outside of my owned or leased consented infrastructure, and essentially impose a cost, or maybe even just kind of blunt the force outside of their owned infrastructure, they would be in violation of what's called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. Right? That's violation of law. Right? We're not in the business of condoning that or supporting that. That being said, we shouldn't be putting companies in that situation where the only remedy they have is to essentially kind of act outside of their lawful authority. We need to create safe neighborhoods. We need to make sure that the commodities that they buy and that they use are in fact inherently resilient. We need to make sure we understand the nature of the transgressions in that neighborhood and deal with those before they before they have that effect. We need to create systems of systems that take on the same effect that we've modeled in the physical world in the cyber world. There's a lot of investment to be made about how you create the inherent resilience and robustness, how do you allocate the roles and responsibilities, how do you then deal with transgressors who continue to offend in that space. But unless you get all of those things right, you don't have a system within which you can operate rationally. And we need to make it such that we do have systems within which you can operate rationally. But the strategy in the short term cannot be that we turn everyone into a hacktivist or someone who takes the law into their own hands. Why? Their powers, first, it's unlawful, but second, their powers of discernment aren't what they might be. The thing they think is afflicting them, they probably have not properly diagnosed, and they might be, in fact, attacking something that's in the middle, right? It itself has been recently taken over. They might be up against something that they can't deal with. Let's imagine for a moment they're up against a nation state, which has considerably more capability, capacity, and a multiplicity of tools at their disposal. That's not a fair fight. You don't want that to be going on. And there's just a whole lot of reasons why that just doesn't work. But as I said earlier, we just can't say no. We have to actually say, so what's the alternative? And that alternative is to be found in a strategy that addresses all of the systemic elements. If I might just say, it's been a delight to be with you today. Thanks again for turning off the heathen detector. I wish us all the best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis, for your exceptional presentation and remarks. You have contributed significantly to the value of today's symposium. I know you need to catch a plane out of here, so safe travels and keep the nation safe.